Hi, I'm Luis-Manuel Garcia, and I will be responsible for the next half hour of entertainment, not of the musical sort, but of the talky sort. And I've been invited by the three organizers of VEM, of Valuing Electronic Music, to give a short paper, a short presentation. I'll introduce myself really briefly and give you an idea of what I do for research, and then the rest of the paper will be a mixture of sort of off-the-cuff sort of discussion and some prepared comments. And also, there will be pretty pictures at various points. A couple of notes before I go. There are a couple of administrative things that I've been asked to communicate to you all. One is that the Twitter hashtag for today's event and for the project in general is hashtag VEM. Very easy. So please Twitter the heck out of that. Also, there is a mailing list sign-up sheet at the bar, on the corner of the bar, to my left, so stage right, I think. And please feel free to write down your email address, in particular for projects that have that are trying to measure some sort of public impact. It's always really important for us to know who's actually been here. So it's also kind of an attendance list. So I do encourage you to sign up for the good of the project. So just to briefly introduce myself, I am trained as an ethnomusicologist, which actually, mercifully, in the UK, actually makes sense. I think most people who've done music studies have heard that term. I currently am based in Berlin, where when I say ethnomusicology, nobody knows what I'm talking about. But it's essentially a mixture of anthropology and music. There's a lot more to it than that, but let's leave it at that. So I do ethnographic work. I study music scenes. I study how music operates sort of socially and culturally. And in particular, I work on electronic music scenes. My first project had to do with house and techno scenes in Chicago, Paris, and Berlin. And now I'm in Berlin doing more research on tourism and techno tourism, so to speak, in Berlin specifically. But today's paper comes from earlier research on all three cities, and having to do more with intimacy and particularly stranger intimacy. I'll talk about this more in the paper, so you'll get an idea of what I mean. Notably, the research that I've done is, at least for this paper, happens from about 2006 to 2010. So why this is significant is because this is chronologically before the whole EDM explosion that has happened in the last few years, which probably many of you are familiar with, like it or not, particularly in North America. So you might notice this as I'm talking about things that I've heard of or discovered or what have you, that some of this may have changed since 2010. And otherwise, just to give you a quick overview of what this paper is about, because there are parts of this which might get a little bit more dense. What this presentation is about is it's trying to describe a particular form of togetherness that happens at electronic music events, at least the electronic music events that I've studied and that I've worked, the scenes that I've worked in. And there's a particular kind of togetherness that sits somewhere between complete anonymity and close familiarity. So forms of loose affiliation, forms of sort of intimacy within networks that are not actually necessarily socially close in the classic sense. And towards the end of my paper, I'll sort of turn towards the VEM project proper and sort of ask some questions about how my paper or what I've been analyzing might speak to the Valuing Electronic Music project. So, without further ado, I'm going to switch into sort of academic prepared notes mode here. Please bear with me. So, the dance floor of a nightclub is in general a place where strangers have no clear reason to feel connected, or at least, and yet they often do. What kind of solidarity would these connections generate, considering that group solidarity, and I'm using the term solidarity here for a particular reason, so considering that this notion of group solidarity is usually articulated around concepts like identity, kinship, and common cause. Certainly, electronic music events and locations, venues, let's say, they may cater to a particular audience and develop a set of regulars over time, but in at least the techno and house nightclubs that I worked in Paris, Berlin, and Chicago, the question of who belongs and how they do are studiously avoided. So this explicit discussion of who actually is part of a particular scene is often avoided for various reasons. In my presentation today, what I want to talk about is how gestures of warmth, social warmth, care, support can manifest in a context of casual contact and vague interpersonal knowledge. So in other words, strangers, or something like strangers. So through engagement with ethnographic vignettes, interviews, and also some social and cultural theory, I describe here a phenomenon that I'm going to call liquidarity, thus the title, which I describe as a slippery togetherness that manages to hold together a heterogeneous crowd. In particular, in liquidarity, vague recognitions and resonances reduce the sense of strangeness in strangers, while at the same time preserving a sense of anonymity. And I'm going to repeat that sentence because there's a lot in there, but it's sort of my main argument, or my main sort of description of the concept, right? So when you're in a state, or when a particular scene or an event has a state of liquidarity, vague recognitions and resonances reduce the sense of strangeness in strangers, while at the same time preserving a sense of anonymity. So there's sort of the best of both worlds, if you want to call it that. In particular, it sustains a sense of belonging that, however fluid, provides a sufficiently firm ground for gestures of social cohesion. So this is, I think, what's sort of interesting socially here, is that while the situation may be fluid and people may not know each other in a particular event, nonetheless, it seems there's some sort of a sense of togetherness that's generated that supports actual concrete actions that seem surprisingly intimate compared to sort of everyday life interactions. So the next part of my the next part of the written form of my paper, I had this sort of written out anecdote because I wanted to start this off with a concrete example from my own research, so from something I had observed and been part of. But it's long and detailed, involves a lot of me sort of over-explaining things to an audience that has never set foot in a nightclub and would not recognize maybe a club like this, which is Berghain in Berlin, but I'm assuming, I think, more background knowledge from this audience. So I'm going to give a more sort of off-the-cuff version of the story, because it's pretty straightforward, and I think for those of you who are familiar with getting into clubs in particular, a lot of this story is going to be very familiar. So this is just a concrete example. So about 5 years ago-ish, I was standing in line in front of this club. This is Berghain and Panorama Bar in Berlin. This was the first or second time that I had been living for a while in Berlin. And importantly, I was there with a friend of mine named Fantomette, who's from Paris. You'll actually hear more from her as an interviewee later in this paper. And she was there with her girlfriend, who was visiting from Paris. It was her birthday. This is a big weekend out. And they had also brought along an additional friend named Lisette. So we were 4 in total. This is the problem because Berghain, the door people there are known for very much selecting against groups, and even a group of 4 could be too much. So in an attempt to sort of game the system in a very a way that many people do, we split into 2 pairs. So Fantomette and her girlfriend, naturally, they went as a couple. They went ahead of us in line. And then I ended up with Lisette, who I had just met that day. I'd never seen her before, but I was put in charge of getting her into the club. A little while later, one of the bouncers who's sort of surveying the line recognizes me. He sees me as he recognizes me as somebody who's been coming to the club regularly or frequently, and he comes up and he asks me if I'm alone. So why is this question important? Because what he was about to do, and I sort of recognize this from having seen this happen to other people on previous visits, is that he was about to pull me out of the line and let me go up to the front, jump the line, guaranteed entry, this whole thing. Which is exciting, except for now he wants to know who I'm with, and depending on who I declare with me, they may come in with me, or it may be that that's too much and none of us get in. In particular, I can say that I'm alone. I can say that I'm with Lisette, this girl who I just met at the beginning of the evening. Or I could also admit to the fact that actually I'm also with these other 2 girls in front of me, and admit also that we're gaming the system, that we're actually 4, but we're going to present ourselves as 2 and 2, etc. And that could end up with all 4 of us not getting in. So in that split second, I decided to sort of split the difference. In particular, what I said was, I'm with Lisette, I'm with this girl next to me, and I left Fantomette and her girlfriend to fend for themselves. We got pulled out of the line, we went up to the front, we got in, all of that is fine, but of course I immediately felt horrible about this. And so, as soon as I got inside, I forced Lisette to stick with me, and we stayed in the garderobe, in the coat check, for the next hour that it took for Fantomette and her girlfriend to get in, on their own steam, so to speak. And thankfully they did get in, because that was also a concern. So they got in. As soon as they get in, I make my profuse apologies to them, and they blow it off. They have, as far as they were concerned, there was no problem. They just sort of shrugged off my apologies and they were sort of confused as to why I felt so particularly guilty about this. And the sense of guilt sort of lingered with me for the rest of the evening, even though I had made apologies that seemed to have not been required. And so why this is an interesting example is because this is a kind of a concrete moment where there were clearly different expectations or different understandings, kind of not incompatible, but at least different or divergent understandings of how we were responsible to each other and for each other within that particular situation. So, we had gone along for a long time, particularly Fantomette and I as friends, I think, assuming maybe that we had a very reciprocal relationship as partygoers. And it turned out that in this particular moment, I assumed expectations that I thought I had violated, which as far as she and her girlfriend were concerned, were completely unnecessary, let's say, or irrelevant. But you can expand this to much larger questions. And here I'm going to go back to some prepared notes. But the questions here speak directly or sort of follow from this anecdote. So, whom can you count on during a night out? And what is expected of you? What do you do if someone from your entourage is refused entry? What if that someone is you? How much care, support, and sharing should be expected of you? Do you share your money, your drinks, your cigarettes, your drugs? If someone is upset or in distress, do you interrupt your own fun to console her or help her? These questions are difficult enough to answer when one is asking about close friends and long-time partying acquaintances, or rather, companions, rather. But it becomes even more difficult to answer these sorts of questions when you're talking about just sort of faint acquaintances or strangers. And yet, partygoers and clubbers navigate these scenes of encounter every weekend, such as in the preceding anecdote, where decisions about ethics and belonging are made with scarce interpersonal knowledge or institutional guidance. In other words, this is something that happens all the time in these scenes where you have to sort of improvise these ethical or not just ethical questions, but these sort of questions of who belongs and how, and what it means to belong. So, at electronic music events in Berlin, Paris, and Chicago, and I would say likely elsewhere, there exists a form of togetherness that finds expression in actions, but is not articulated explicitly. In particular, it is a form of social cohesion that avoids talk about what makes it cohere. This is what I call liquidarity, which generates a space of inclusion uncoupled from identity or other forms of particularized belonging. For liquidarity, vagueness is crucial to sustaining a sense of solidarity in spite of potentially irreconcilable differences. This vagueness comes with its own costs and risks, but it seems well adapted to the increasingly volatile conditions of urban life. So that was just sort of a very brief summary of what I mean by liquidarity, and now I'm going to kind of come back and give more concrete examples of what I've sort of observed in the field. So first, a couple of comments about, sort of generalized comments about nightclub spaces and the nature of nightlife, I guess you could call it. So as places of leisure and nightlife, nightclubs have a vested interest in offering a zone of escape from everyday control by creating an atmosphere of relaxed rules, suspended responsibilities, expanded possibilities, and pleasures unburdened by guilt or sanction. Furthermore, the discourse produced by people as well as the institutions involved in electronic music scenes has often expressed an aspiration for an ethos of inclusivity, equality, and freedom. So in other words, there's a discourse sort of around these scenes as well that aspires to inclusivity and egalitarianism and so on. It's utopian in certain senses. But these expectations and aspirations discourage the discussion of terms of belonging in an explicit way, especially if the articulation of these terms threatens to expose a gap between principle and practice. Thus, both electronic music establishments, so nightclubs mostly here, venues, and their clientele avoid formalizing these rules of engagement with others because this in turn forces each partygoer to improvise his or her actions while relying on incomplete knowledge. This is sort of the example that I was giving earlier. In other words, the desire for interactions to be simple, to be smooth, unencumbered, and unproblematic pushes these complex and potentially contentious details of togetherness out of explicit discourse. And this reticence allows itself to be read, and maybe misread, as a tacit consensus, as a shared or compatible ethics. So during interviews, I asked scene participants, in other words, partygoers, clubbers, scenesters, let's say, I asked them to provide examples of an event where they experienced a strong sense of cohesion, and then to give their thoughts on what contributed to this sense. Their examples and theories were diverse, but they tended to cluster around two theories of collective cohesion. So two theories of why why these crowds come together the way they do at music events. And their theories were additive and subtractive. So what do I mean by additive and subtractive? By additive, I mean that, that in some explanations they posited a sort of common factor, something external to everyone, but to which everyone was attached. And this would suture the crowd together. This would sort of underwrite their connectivity to each other. Subtractive theories, on the other hand, or subtractive explanations, credited the removal or the masking of something in facilitating the cultivation of solidarity and sort of group togetherness. So to give you some examples, one additive theory that was shared by nearly everyone I interviewed was the notion that a shared taste in music ensured a similarity or compatibility of personality and of comportment. This meant that a particular type of music attracted people of a particular sensory, corporeal, and aesthetic attunement. Now here I'm sort of repeating the explanations that were given to me. So I'm not necessarily endorsing this explanation, but this is how things were explained to me often in interviews. So shared taste in a particular kind of music attracts people of a particular sort. And what that sort is remains often unexplained in detail, let's say. And so it's this, according to this explanation, it's this attunement that it encompasses a range of compatible personalities. Some of the people I interviewed also paired this attraction with deterrence, crediting certain factors with impeding the attendance of those not committed enough to the scene and to the music. So things like locations that are hard to get to, or parties that are not widely advertised. Sort of underground marketing, invite-only things, high ticket prices, so on. Things that create barriers somehow to participation, but barriers that certain people can still get over if they're committed enough. So this is sort of the argument. And so as an example, I want to take something from an interview with Fantomette, who I mentioned earlier on. We have, well, I'll read this out anyways, so you're going to miss a little bit of wording on the right there, but nonetheless. So she is a Parisian DJ and promoter in her late 30s, and she describes here a party that was held by Mobile Records. So this is a record label based in Berlin, and they had a summer soiree in 2008, and it was held at a club called Rechenzentrum, which is, at the time, it was very far away from the center of the Berlin scene, so to speak. It was well into the east in Rummelsburg, close to Lichtenberg, which now is not so out of the way, but at the time it was considered a big deal to go all the way out there for a party. So here I'm going to read out her quote here, because the whole thing is quite interesting. She says, you know, I found the same thing, and what she means by the same thing is the sense of cohesion and collectivity. When we were at Rechenzentrum in Berlin, it was really far away. It was a bit of an adventure to get there. You really had to be motivated. And once you got there, a skimming, and she says here in French, écrémage, so sort of a skimming in the sense of skimmed milk, had already taken place, which makes it such that the only people one finds there are those who are there for the music, who are motivated and who are in a special state of mind, who, in principle, draw together. In any case, everyone there was close to one another. So in her view, the atmosphere on the dance floor benefits from not insurmountable obstacles to entry. Notably, this rests on the assumption that people partying for the right reasons, whatever that might be, will be willing to expend more resources, more effort to attend a particular event than those going for the wrong reasons. So again, there's a lot of vagueness going on here, which my argument is kind of part of how this works. So to give you another example of a subtractive theory going on, one that was shared by a number of interviewees was the idea that, or it was based on generalizations about nightlife itself and on nocturnal settings. So for many of them, nightlife contexts destabilize social structure and loosen a lot of these tethers of identity, a lot of these sort of social barriers and rules, which thus facilitate intimacy with strangers. So this is sort of the logic they were providing. So Fantomette, again, describes the contrast between daily life and nightlife crowds. She interrupts herself and restarts her explanation 3 times, and I've preserved this interruption because it's actually really interesting. And she's trying to work out the relationship between nocturnal worlds or nightlife, this lack of interpersonal knowledge, sort of not knowing each other all that well, and social barriers. So here's the quote. She says, I think that the slightest barrier, I think that it's already nighttime, but you don't have, hold on. Let me pull this up so you can actually read along with me. This makes more sense. Here we go. So I think that it's already nighttime, and you don't have, well, when you look at the majority of people that one encounters at a party, you know their first names, you don't even know their last names, you don't know about jobs, you don't know their brothers and sisters, you don't know. Ultimately, you know a fair number of people at a very embryonic stage, and in turn, you have less of those social barriers that you might have during the daytime. Or, in any case, you don't self-impose these barriers because of social or cultural differences or money, you see. So in this context, a lack of knowledge or familiarity blurs and occludes differences, loosening normative social and moral bonds articulated by difference and dissolving blockages to social flows. So it is out of this sort of subtractive strain of theory that my own notion of liquidarity also emerges. So this idea of vagueness also as a form of sort of reduction of detail that actually allows a certain kind of social fluidity. So my claim here is that the discourse about collective belonging and ethics remain vague because that is how crowds work. When they do cohere well, it is because of the vagueness of their composition, not in spite of it. Now, I use the term liquidarity for this phenomenon to make an analogy with an underlying metaphor of solidarity. I describe this togetherness as liquid because, much like molecules in a liquid, the bonds between those on the dance floor or at these events are constantly shifting and sliding, and also unstable. So liquidarity describes how we can feel connected without explicitly articulating these terms of the terms of relation, so to speak. It thrives on this vagueness, which allows a diverse group of strangers, acquaintances, and friends to act as if they were a solid group. And now, I'm going to skip over a whole big chunk of my paper, because this had been originally a much more academic version, let's say, and there was a lot of social and cultural theory, which has now been reduced to one slide. So I'm essentially putting this up here in case anybody would like to ask me later about some of this in more detail, because otherwise we will need another 30 minutes. But you can see Bourdieu, not surprisingly, comes up here a lot, but also Southerton's take on taste communities. And then there's a whole anthropological discourse on ritual and communitas through Van Gennep and Turner. And then most importantly, this is sort of low on the slide here, Lauren Berlant's notion of intimate public is really important for my understanding of liquidarity, so feel free to ask me about it later. But what's important, or what is worth mentioning here, is that Lauren Berlant's theory of intimate publics, I mean, she imagines intimate publics as a kind of a collectivity with a really low bar to entry. So she was imagining, or she was studying actually sort of women's culture through film, women's culture in quotation marks from the 19th century to sort of mid-20th century, and the way in which certain films try to address this imagined audience of female spectators based on this idea that anybody who had lived through the experience of being a woman would somehow, they would all identify with this subject position, even though they come from very different backgrounds and have very different experiences. And so she was calling this an intimate public, because it's a public in the sense of an audience, but its conditions of belonging are based on intimate aspects of one's life, particularly around feeling and emotion. And so it's something that's important for this notion of liquidarity, because I would argue that a lot of this sense of cohesion, despite social and cultural difference, hinges on shared feeling. So shared musical experience, shared emotions, or at least the idea of shared feeling. So here I'm wrapping up. Liquidarity is a way of absorbing, and bracketing difference without enforcing homogeneous identities, and thus it can be seen as maybe an adaptation to a very real increase in everyday diversity brought about by globalization. In particular, it seems well adapted to the heterogeneity, anonymity, and volatility of urban settings. Now here, yeah, good. But at the same time, it should be noticed that this blurring of difference also risks disarming the antagonisms of difference that can fuel political action. So for proponents of so-called agonistic politics, and here like Laclau and Mouffe would be good examples of this, this sort of low drama form of belonging can actually have high stakes. What allows a group to come together despite potentially disruptive differences also allows it to ignore the inequities that these differences may represent. So by consistently or constantly deferring talk of who is included and who's excluded and so on, liquidarity also sustains a kind of fantasy that has the very real effect of both creating a scene of collective care, but yet also rendering invisible these fissures and failures. So this is where the bargain, or this is a sort of an ambivalent bargain that liquidarity makes with difference. And so here now, I'm going to actually sort of get rid of the conclusion that I normally had prepared, and instead say a few things about essentially how I see Liquidarity and more generally this paper as connecting to the VEM project, the Valuing Electronic Music project. And in particular, there's, you can already ask some questions, or you can think already about comparison and contrast. In particular, the ways in which the case that I'm working with has some commonalities with what you're going to hear in about an hour actually from the project organizers, but also with some distinctions. In particular, I've always been working ethnographically with, let's say, sort of real-time, face-to-face dance floor in situations. So I've been studying, when I'm thinking about intimacy and sort of loose affiliation and loose association like this, I'm thinking about music events that are happening where everybody's in the room together and there's some sort of face-to-face interaction, and it's sort of real-time to the extent that that is a thing. Whereas for the VEM project, my understanding is that they're very much more working on, they're very much more working on online intimacies or online connections where the interactions are not necessarily face-to-face, and they may be sort of time shifted and they're also spatially distant. Nonetheless, though, I think it'd be interesting to look at the ways in which within these scenes, within these also distributed scenes across SoundCloud, Mixcloud, Facebook, MySpace as well, and so on, the ways in which these themes of sort of intimacy with people you don't know, or maybe intimacy is too heavy of a word, but forms of sociability and contact evolve that sit somewhere between these border zones of total stranger and friend, or business partner, and so on. And I think one of the important questions that I think you could ask of the VEM project would be whether or not words like professionalism or concepts like professionalism really fully describe the sorts of messy overlap between personal life, social networking, professional networking, supporting other artists, and so on. These sorts of things that happen within electronic music scenes, particularly among producers and DJs. And so with that, I think time-wise, this is a good moment to stop. So I'll leave it at that, and then I think we have a few minutes left for questions. Right? Yeah. Thanks, everyone.